The mountain air was cold that morning, the kind of cold that bites at your face and makes your breath look like smoke. Jake had been living alone up here for 7 years now, and he liked it that way. No people, no questions, no painful memories staring him in the face every single day. His cabin sat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. Most folks had forgotten he even existed, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The only sounds up here were the wind through the pine trees, the occasional call of a hawk, and the steady rhythm of his axe-splitting wood. Jake was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that had gone mostly gray. His hands were rough and calloused from years of hard work. He didn't talk much anymore. Didn't see the point when there was nobody around to listen. That morning started like any other. Jake stepped outside his cabin just after sunrise, grabbed his axe, and headed to the woodpile. Winter was coming early this year, and he needed to stock up. The first swing of the axe echoed through the quiet forest, and he fell into the familiar rhythm of work. But something felt different today. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know when eyes were on him. He stopped mid-swing and looked around slowly, scanning the tree line. At first, he saw nothing. Just trees and shadows and the early morning mist hanging low to the ground. But then, behind a thick pine tree about 30 feet away, he caught a glimpse of movement. Something small. Something that definitely wasn't a deer or a bear. Jake set down his axe carefully and wiped his hands on his worn jeans. "I know you're there," he called out, his voice rough from lack of use. "You might as well come out." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, a girl stepped out from behind the tree. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, maybe 13. She was tiny and thin, so thin that Jake could see her collarbone sticking out above her dirty t-shirt. Her dark hair was tangled and matted, and her face was smudged with dirt. She wore jeans with holes in the knees and sneakers that were falling apart. An old backpack hung from her shoulders, looking like it might tear apart any second. But what struck Jake most were her eyes. They were dark and intense, and they looked at him without any fear. This kid had been through something. You could see it in the way she stood, weight on the balls of her feet, ready to run at any second. But she wasn't running. She was just standing there, staring at him. "You lost?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. He wasn't good with people anymore, especially not kids, but he knew enough not to scare her off. The girl didn't answer right away. She studied him carefully, like she was trying to decide something important. Her hands gripped the straps of her backpack so tight her knuckles turned white. "You're the mountain man," she finally said. It wasn't a question. Jake frowned. "I'm just a man who lives on a mountain. What are you doing up here? Where are your parents?" "Don't have any," the girl said simply. She took a step closer, and Jake could see she was shivering. Her lips had a slight blue tint, and her thin jacket was nowhere near warm enough for mountain weather. "I've been looking for you." That caught Jake off guard. "Looking for me? Kid, I don't even know you." "How would you be looking for me?" "People in town talk about you," she said, taking another step forward. "They say you live up here all alone. They say you don't bother nobody and nobody bothers you. They say you used to be different before something bad happened." Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't like people talking about him. Didn't like them knowing his business. "Whatever they told you, it's not—" "I don't care about your past," the girl interrupted. "I care about right now." She walked right up to him then, close enough that Jake could see she had a cut on her cheek and a bruise on her arm. Close enough that he could smell the fact that she hadn't bathed in days, maybe weeks. Close enough that he could see her whole body trembling, though whether from cold or fear or something else, he couldn't tell. And then she said the words that would change everything. "You're coming with me," she said, her voice steady and determined despite the shaking. "I need a father." Jake stood there completely frozen. Of all the things he'd expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and just stared at this strange, dirty, determined little girl who had appeared out of nowhere with the most impossible request. "Kid, I think you've got the wrong person," he finally managed to say. I'm not. You need to go to the police or social services or—" "No," the girl said firmly. "I need you. I've thought about this for a long time. I tracked you for 3 days to make sure. You're the one." "The one for what?" Jake asked, feeling a panic rising in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Look, I don't know what you think I can do for you, but I need someone who won't send me back," she said, and for the first time, her voice cracked just a little. "I need someone who understands what it's like to want to be left alone. I need someone who won't try to fix me or change me or send me to another place where people pretend to care, but really just want the check they get for keeping me. Jake felt something twist in his chest. He wanted to walk away, to go back inside his cabin and pretend this conversation never happened, but those eyes kept staring at him, full of a hope so desperate it hurt to look at. "What's your name?" he heard himself ask. "Everyone calls me Scout," the girl said. "I don't like my real name." "Well, Scout," Jake said slowly, "I appreciate that you're in a tough spot, but I'm not the person who can help you. I live alone for a reason. I'm not good with people anymore. I'm not good with any of this." Scout's expression didn't change. She just kept staring at him with those intense eyes. "I don't need you to be good at it," she said. "I just need you to try. That's more than most people do." Jake shook his head. "You need to go back to town. I'll drive you myself if you want, but you can't stay here." "I'm not going back," Scout said simply. "If you won't help me, I'll just stay in the woods. I've been doing it for a while now. I'm pretty good at it." She turned then, starting to walk back toward the trees. Jake watched her go, telling himself it wasn't his problem, that he couldn't take responsibility for some random kid who showed up out of nowhere. He had his own problems, his own pain that he was still trying to live with. But as Scout reached the tree line, Jake saw her stumble slightly, catching herself against a tree trunk. She stood there for a moment, and even from a distance he could see how exhausted she was, how much effort it took just to keep standing. Jake cursed under his breath. He knew he was going to regret this. Every instinct told him to let her go, to protect the quiet, isolated life he'd built. But something stronger than instinct, something he thought had died 7 years ago, made him call out, "Wait." Scout turned around slowly, and Jake could swear he saw the tiniest hint of relief cross her face. "Just for tonight," Jake said, already knowing it was a lie, already knowing that nothing was ever just for tonight. "You can sleep in the cabin, get warm, get some food. But tomorrow we figure out what to do with you. Deal?" Scout walked back toward him, and this time her steps were a little steadier. "Deal," she said quietly. As Jake led her toward the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that his whole world had just shifted on its axis. This girl, this impossible, determined girl, had walked out of the forest and asked him to be something he'd sworn he'd never be again, a father. And despite every wall he'd built, despite every year spent hiding from the world, some part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd chosen the right mountain man after all. The inside of Jake's cabin was simple and clean. One main room served as kitchen, living room, and dining area. A small hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything was made of wood, worn smooth by years of use. It smelled like pine and wood smoke and coffee. Scout stood in the doorway, taking it all in. Jake noticed she didn't step inside right away. She just stood there on the threshold like she was waiting for permission, or maybe waiting to see if it was a trap. "Come on in," Jake said gruffly, moving past her to the kitchen area. "I'll make some food." Scout finally stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She kept her backpack on, her hands still gripping the straps. Jake pretended not to notice. He'd seen enough scared animals in his life to know you didn't push too hard too fast. He pulled out a pot and started making soup. Nothing fancy, just some canned vegetables and meat he'd preserved himself. As it heated on the stove, Jake glanced over at Scout. She was still standing in the same spot, just watching him. "You can sit down," Jake said, nodding toward the old couch near the fireplace. "There's a bathroom down the hall if you want to clean up." Scout hesitated, then slowly walked to the couch. But she didn't sit on it. Instead, she sat on the floor beside it, her back against the wall where she could see both the door and Jake. Smart kid, Jake thought. Always keep your exits in sight. They ate in silence. Jake gave Scout a big bowl of soup and some bread he'd made a few days ago. She ate quickly, hungrily, barely stopping to breathe between bites. When she finished, Jake gave her more without asking. She ate that too. After dinner, Jake showed Scout to the spare bedroom. It was small and dusty, filled with boxes he'd never bothered to unpack. An old bed sat in the corner with a bare mattress. "I'll get you some blankets," Jake said. "There's sheets in the closet if you want to make the bed. Bathroom's right across the hall." Scout looked at the bed like she'd never seen one before. "This is for me?" she asked quietly. "Just for tonight," Jake reminded her, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. "We'll figure things out tomorrow." That night, Jake lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling. What had he done? He couldn't take care of a kid. He could barely take care of himself most days. Tomorrow he'd have to call someone, get her the proper help she needed. That was the right thing to do. But when morning came, Jake didn't make any calls. Scout was already awake when he got up, sitting on the front porch steps. She'd washed her face and her hair looked a little less tangled, though she clearly needed a proper shower and clean clothes. "Morning," Jake said awkwardly. "You hungry?" "I can help with breakfast," Scout said, standing up quickly. "I'm good at cooking, and cleaning, and chopping wood. I can earn my keep," Jake frowned. "You don't need to earn anything. You're just a kid." "I'm 12, Scout said, like that made her an adult. "Almost 13. I've been taking care of myself for 8 months. I know how to work. 8 months. Jake felt that twist in his chest again. This girl had been on her own for 8 months and somehow she'd survived. 8 months of sleeping who knows where, eating who knows what, dealing with who knows what kind of danger. "Fine," Jake said finally. "You can help with breakfast. But after that, we need to talk about what happens next." But that talk never really happened. Days turned into a week and Scout was still there. Jake kept telling himself it was temporary, that he'd make the call tomorrow, that he'd take her to town and sort this out properly. But something always stopped him. Maybe it was the way Scout never complained about anything. She helped with chores without being asked, learned quickly, and stayed out of his way when he needed space. She didn't push him to talk or try to force some kind of relationship. She just existed there quietly making herself useful. Or maybe it was the nightmares. The first time Jake heard Scout screaming in the middle of the night, he'd burst into her room thinking there was an intruder. But she was alone, thrashing in bed, caught in whatever hell her mind had created. Jake had stood there helplessly, not knowing what to do, until Scout woke up gasping. She'd looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, and all she'd said was, "Sorry, I'll be quieter." That had broken something in Jake. No kid should have to apologize for nightmares. 2 weeks in, Scout started opening up a little. They were splitting wood together when she suddenly spoke. "My mom died when I was 9, she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Overdose. They found her in a motel bathroom. I was at school." Jake stopped mid-swing. He didn't know what to say, so he just listened. "I never knew my dad. Mom said he left before I was born. After she died, I went into the system. Foster care." Scout spit out those last 2 words like they tasted bad. First home wasn't terrible, just boring. But the mom got pregnant with her own kid and suddenly there wasn't room for me anymore. She picked up a piece of wood and examined it closely, like it was the most interesting thing she'd ever seen. Second home was worse. The dad looked at me weird. "I left after 3 months. You ran away?" Jake asked quietly. Scout shook her head. "Told my social worker. She didn't believe me.
Said I was causing trouble because I had attachment issues. Moved me to a third home."
"That one." She trailed off and Jake saw her jaw clench. "That one was bad. The mom didn't want me there. The dad was drunk most of the time. There were 4 other kids, all younger, all scared. I tried to take care of them, but I couldn't. I couldn't fix it." Jake felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "So you left?" "So I left," Scout confirmed. "Been on the street since February. I learned fast. Where to sleep, where to find food, who to avoid. There's other kids out there too. They taught me stuff. How to stay invisible, how to tell which adults are safe and which ones aren't." "And you decided I was safe?" Jake asked. Scout looked at him directly. "I decided you were alone, like me. I figured maybe we could be alone together." That night, Jake pulled out an old photo album he'd kept hidden in his closet. He hadn't looked at it in years, couldn't bear to. But something about Scout's honesty made him want to be honest too. He found Scout reading a book on the couch, one of the few novels he'd kept around. She looked up when he sat down in the chair across from her. "I had a family once," Jake said, his voice rough. "A wife. Her name was Beth. And a son, Tommy. He was 8. Scout closed her book carefully and waited. "We were driving home from Tommy's baseball game. It was raining dark. I was tired. I didn't see the other car until it was too late." Jake's hands trembled as he opened the photo album. "They died. Both of them. I walked away with scratches. They died." Scout moved from the couch to sit on the floor near Jake's chair, looking at the photos he showed her. A beautiful woman with kind eyes. A little boy with a gap-toothed smile. "It wasn't your fault," Scout said softly. "Everyone said that. The police, the therapist, my friends, what was left of my family. But it was my fault. I was driving. I should have been more careful. I should have seen that car. I should have. Jake's voice broke. I should have died instead of them. Scout didn't try to argue with him. She didn't offer empty comfort or tell him it would get better. She just sat there letting him hurt. Is that why you came up here? She asked after a while. To hide? To survive, Jake corrected. I couldn't be around people anymore. Couldn't stand their pity or their advice. I just wanted to be alone with my guilt. And now I messed that up, Scout said. But there was the tiniest hint of a smile on her face. Despite everything, Jake almost smiled too. Yeah, you really did. They sat in comfortable silence after that. Two broken people who'd found each other by accident, or maybe by fate. Neither one fixed, neither one healed, but somehow together a little less alone. But Jake knew this couldn't last forever. Scout was a runaway. People had to be looking for her. And he was just a man hiding on a mountain, not a father, not a guardian, not anything official. Reality would catch up with them eventually. Jake just hoped when it did he'd know what to do, because for the first time in 7 years Jake had something to lose again. And that scared him more than anything. 3 weeks had passed since Scout showed up at Jake's cabin, and a strange sort of routine had developed between them. Jake would wake up first, start the coffee, and usually find Scout already outside doing something useful. She'd taken over feeding the chickens he kept, had reorganized his messy tool shed, and somehow managed to fix the squeaky hinge on the front door that had been driving him crazy for months. The kid was capable, more capable than any 12-year-old should need to be, and that bothered Jake more than he wanted to admit. One morning, Jake came outside to find Scout up on a ladder, cleaning the gutters on the cabin's roof. Get down from there, Jake called out, his heart jumping into his throat. You're gonna fall and break your neck. Scout looked down at him, confused. I'm fine. I used to do this at the second foster home all the time. Mrs. Chen was too old to get up here, so I did it. Well, you're not doing it here, Jake said firmly. I can clean my own gutters. You're a kid. You should be doing kid things. Scout climbed down the ladder slowly. Like what? Jake opened his mouth to answer, then realized he had no idea. What did kids do? What did normal kids do who weren't trying to survive on their own? He remembered Tommy liked baseball and video games and riding his bike. But Scout wasn't Tommy, and this wasn't that life. I don't know, Jake admitted. But not cleaning gutters. That's my job. Okay, Scout said simply. But Jake could see she was confused. In her world, everyone had to pull their weight or they became a burden. And burdens got thrown away. That afternoon, Jake decided to go into town for supplies. He'd been putting it off, but they were running low on food, and Scout needed clothes that actually fit her. She'd been wearing his old t-shirts as pajamas, and her own clothes were falling apart. You coming? Jake asked Scout, who was reading on the porch. Scout looked up, startled. To town? Where else would I be going for supplies? Mars? I should stay here, Scout said quickly. Someone might recognize me. Jake had thought about that. We'll be quick. And you can wear my old cap. Keep your head down. But you need clothes, and I'm not good at guessing sizes. The drive down the mountain was quiet. Scout pressed her face to the window, watching the trees rush by. Jake realized this was probably the first time she'd been in a car in months. In town, Jake headed to the general store, the kind of place that sold everything from groceries to work boots. Scout stuck close to him, the cap pulled low over her eyes. Jake grabbed the basics quickly, then headed to the small clothing section. Pick out some things, he told Scout. Whatever you need. Scout looked at the clothes like they might bite her. I don't need much. Pick out some things, Jake repeated more gently this time. Jeans, shirts, a warm jacket. Winter's coming. While Scout carefully selected the cheapest items she could find, Jake grabbed a few extras when she wasn't looking. Good socks, thermal underwear, a decent winter coat. If she was staying, and it seemed like she was, she needed to be warm. At the checkout, the woman behind the counter, Mrs. Patterson, gave Jake a curious look. She'd known him for years, knew he lived alone. Having a visitor? She asked pleasantly, eyeing Scout. Niece? Jake said quickly, surprising himself with how easily the lie came. Visiting for a while. Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly at Scout. Well, isn't that nice? It's good for old Jake here to have some company. In the truck on the way back, Scout was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, You told her I was your niece. Seemed simpler than the truth, Jake said, keeping his eyes on the road. What is the truth? Scout asked. Jake thought about that. I don't know yet. But that night the truth got a lot more complicated. Jake was awakened by a knock on his door at almost midnight. He grabbed his flashlight and opened it to find Sheriff Linda Morrison standing there looking apologetic. Jake, she said quietly, can we talk? Jake's stomach dropped. He glanced back toward Scout's room, but the door was closed. What's this about, Linda? Can I come in? Jake led her inside, his mind racing. Linda had been sheriff for 5 years. She was fair, honest, and didn't miss much. They'd known each other since before Jake moved to the mountains, back when he was still part of the world. Linda sat down at the kitchen table and Jake sat across from her, the flashlight between them casting strange shadows. I saw you in town today, Linda said. With a girl. Jake said nothing, just waited. That girl matches the description of a runaway named Lily Chen, 12 years old, been missing since February. There's been a search, posters, the whole thing. Linda pulled out a paper from her jacket and slid it across the table. Jake looked at the poster. It was Scout, but the photo was old from before. She looked younger, cleaner, almost like a different person, but it was definitely her. Her name's Scout, Jake said quietly. Her name is Lily Chen and she's a ward of the state. Linda corrected gently. Jake, I know you've been through a lot, and I understand wanting to help someone, but you can't just keep a runaway child without reporting it. That's kidnapping, even if your intentions are good. I didn't kidnap anyone, Jake said, feeling anger rise in his chest. She came to me. She asked for help. I believe you, Linda said, but that doesn't change the law. She needs to be returned to her caseworker, put back into a proper foster home. They hurt her, Jake said, his voice low and hard. The foster homes. That's why she ran. You want to send her back to that? Linda sighed, and Jake could see she wasn't happy about this either. I don't have all the details of her case. But Jake, you're not set up to take care of a child. You live alone on a mountain. You don't have a job, you're not in the system, and legally you have no rights to her. So what are you saying? I'm saying you need to bring her to my office tomorrow morning. We'll contact her caseworker, start the proper process. Maybe it won't be the same foster home. Maybe they can find something better. And if I don't? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I'll have to come back with a warrant and take her by force, and you'll be charged with interfering with custody and possibly kidnapping. Linda stood up. I don't want to do that, Jake. You're a good man. But this is the law. After Linda left, Jake sat in the dark for a long time. He should wake Scout, tell her what happened, prepare her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he thought about the past few weeks, how Scout had slowly started to smile more, how she'd stopped flinching every time he moved too fast, how she'd actually laughed yesterday when a chicken had chased her around the yard. And he thought about Tommy, his son, who'd never get to grow up, never get another chance. Jake had failed Tommy. He'd failed his wife. He'd failed everyone who mattered. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fail Scout. By the time the sun rose, Jake had made a decision. It was crazy. It was probably impossible. But it was the only chance they had. When Scout came out of her room, yawning and heading for the coffee pot, Jake was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him. What's all that? Scout asked. Sit down, Jake said. We need to talk. Scout's face went pale. You're sending me back. No, Jake said firmly. I'm not. But the sheriff knows you're here. She's coming back today to take you unless I bring you in first. Scout was already moving toward her room, probably to grab her backpack and run. Jake stood up quickly. Wait, just wait and listen. Jake took a deep breath. There might be another way. A legal way. But it's going to be hard, and there's no guarantee it'll work. Scout stopped in the doorway to her room. What way? I could try to become your foster parent. Maybe eventually adopt you if you wanted that. But it would mean following all their rules, letting people come here and check on us, proving I can take care of you properly. Jake ran his hand through his hair. I'm not even sure they'd approve me. I've been hiding from the world for 7 years. I don't have a regular job. I'm probably still depressed according to any therapist. But I could try, if you want me to. Scout stood very still, her back to him. When she finally turned around, her eyes were shining with tears she refused to let fall. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because you were right, Jake said. We're alone. And maybe we could be alone together. Maybe we could try to be a family even if we don't really know how. Scout crossed the room and stood in front of Jake. She looked up at him with those intense dark eyes that had first caught his attention weeks ago. I need to tell you something, she said. My real name isn't Scout, and it's not Lily either. My mom called me Maya. Just Maya. No one's called me that since she died. Jake nodded slowly. Okay, Maya, you want me to call you that? Maybe, Maya said. Maybe someday. But Scout is okay for now. Scout is who I am out here. Then Scout it is, Jake said. Scout reached out and took Jake's hand. Her hand was small and rough and cold. Jake squeezed it gently. If we do this, Scout said, if we really try, you have to promise me something. What? Don't give up. Even when it gets hard. Even when they say no. Even when I mess up, because I will mess up. Don't give up on me. Jake felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he'd built years ago starting to crumble. I promise, he said, and he meant it. Jake and Scout drove down the mountain that morning in silence. Scout wore her new clothes and the baseball cap pulled low, her hands gripping her knees so tight her knuckles were white. Jake kept glancing at her, wondering if this was the right decision or if he was about to make everything worse. Sheriff Morrison's office was in the center of town, a small brick building that also housed the fire department. Jake parked out front and turned to Scout. You ready? He asked. Scout nodded, though she looked anything but ready. What's going to happen? We're going to tell the truth, Jake said. And then we're going to ask for a chance. Inside, Sheriff Morrison was waiting in her office. She looked relieved when she saw them, but also concerned. She gestured for them to sit down. I'm glad you came in, Jake, she said. Then she looked at Scout with kind eyes. Hello, Lily. Scout, the girl said quietly but firmly. I go by Scout now. Linda nodded respectfully. Scout, then. I'm Sheriff Morrison. I know you've been through a lot, and I want you to know that I'm here to help figure out what's best for you. Not what's easiest, but what's actually best. Jake was surprised. He'd expected Linda to just call the caseworker and be done with it, but she seemed genuinely concerned. I spent yesterday afternoon making some calls, Linda continued, looking at some papers on her desk. I talked to your caseworker, Mrs. Foster. I also talked to some people at Child Services. Your case is complicated. What does that mean? Jake asked. Linda sighed. It means that Scout here has been through 5 different placements in 3 years. The last one, the one she ran from, has been flagged for investigation. 2 other children have been removed from that home since Scout left. Scout's face went very still. Jake felt rage building in his chest. So she was telling the truth. That place was dangerous and nobody believed her. Nobody followed up the way they should have, Linda corrected carefully. Mrs. Foster is overworked, handling twice as many cases as she should. Things slip through the cracks. It's not an excuse, but it's the reality. So what happens now? Scout asked, her voice small. Well, normally I'd have to take you back into state custody immediately, Linda said, but I made another call last night. To a family lawyer I know in the city. Her name is Patricia Wong, and she specializes in foster care and adoption cases. Jake leaned forward. And she said that if you're serious about pursuing guardianship or foster care, you need to act fast. The state won't just let Scout stay with you while you figure it out. But if you file the proper paperwork, start the process officially, you might be able to argue for temporary placement while the application is reviewed. How temporary? Jake asked. Could be months. Could be longer. But Patricia said your case is unusual enough that it might work in your favor. Scout came to you voluntarily. She's been safe and cared for in your home. And given her history, placing her back in the system right now could be traumatic. Scout looked at Jake with something like hope in her eyes. Jake had seen that look on Tommy's face once when he'd promised to take him to a baseball game. It was a look that said, please don't let me down. What do I need to do? Jake asked. Linda slid a business card across the desk. Call Patricia. Today she's expecting to hear from you. But Jake, I need to be honest with you. This isn't going to be easy. You're going to have to prove you can provide a stable home. That means regular income, psychological evaluation, home inspection, background checks, parenting classes, the whole thing. Jake felt overwhelmed just hearing the list. I can do that. Can you? Linda asked gently. Jake, you've been living alone on that mountain for 7 years. You've barely been part of society. You're going to have to change your whole life. I know, Jake said. He looked at Scout, who was staring at him with those intense eyes. But I have to try. Linda nodded slowly. Okay, then here's what's going to happen. I'm going to document this conversation. I'm going to note that Scout is safe, healthy, and has expressed a desire to stay with you. I'm going to recommend to Mrs. Foster that Scout be placed with you temporarily while you pursue formal guardianship. But Jake, if at any point I think Scout is at risk or you're not following through on what you need to do, I'll remove her myself. Understood? Understood, Jake said. Linda turned to Scout. And you. You have a voice in this too. If at any time you don't feel safe with Jake or you want to leave, you tell me. You're not trapped there. This only works if it's what you want. Okay? Scout nodded. It's what I want. They left the sheriff's office with Patricia Wong's business card and a deadline. Jake had 48 hours to contact the lawyer and start the formal process. If he didn't, Linda would have no choice but to place Scout back in state custody. In the truck, Scout finally spoke. Did that really just happen? Are you really going to try to keep me? I'm really going to try, Jake said. But Scout, you heard what the sheriff said. This is going to be hard. They're going to look at every part of my life, every part of our lives. There's going to be people coming to the cabin, asking questions, making sure you're okay. I'm going to have to see a therapist and prove I'm mentally fit. I'm going to have to get a regular job. I don't want to ruin your life, Scout said quietly. Jake pulled the truck over to the side of the road and turned to look at her. You're not ruining anything. My life was already ruined, remember? I was just hiding from it. Maybe this is what I need. Maybe we both need this. Scout smiled then, a real smile, and Jake felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. They drove back to the cabin and Jake immediately called Patricia Wong. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was professional but warm. Sheriff Morrison told me about your situation, Patricia said. I'll be honest with you, Jake. This is going to be an uphill battle. The state doesn't usually grant guardianship to single men with no experience, especially when they've been essentially isolated for years. But it's not impossible. What are my chances? Jake asked. If we do everything right? Maybe 50-50, but that's better than zero, which is what you have if you don't try. Patricia explained the process. First, Jake would need to file a petition for guardianship. That required paperwork, fees, and a court date. While that was pending, they'd request temporary placement based on Scout's wishes and her history in the system. You're going to need to prove stability, Patricia explained. That means income. What do you do for work? I don't really work, Jake admitted. I have some savings and I live simply. That won't cut it. You need to show regular employment. Can you get a job quickly? Jake thought about it. Maybe. There's a wilderness guide company in town. They've asked me before if I wanted to lead hiking trips. I know these mountains better than anyone. Perfect. Get that job. Show them you're willing to re-enter society for this child. Patricia paused.
Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest.
Why are you doing this? Why this girl specifically? Jake looked across the room at Scout, who was pretending to read but clearly listening to every word. Because she saved me. Jake said simply. I was dying up here, just slowly fading away. And she walked out of the woods and asked me to be her father. Nobody's needed me in 7 years, and I forgot what it felt like to be needed. That's good, Patricia said. That's honest. Hold on to that, because they're going to question your motives. They're going to suggest you're lonely or having some kind of crisis or that you don't know what you're getting into. Maybe I don't, Jake admitted, but I'm going to figure it out. They talked for another hour, Patricia explaining everything that needed to happen. By the end of the call, Jake had a list of tasks that seemed impossible. After he hung up, Scout came over and looked at the list. That's a lot, she said. Yeah, Jake agreed. Are you scared? Jake thought about that. Was he scared? Terrified was more like it. Scared of failing, scared of letting Scout down, scared of opening himself up to loss again. Yes, he said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. Scout nodded. That's what brave means. Not being unafraid. Just doing it even when you're scared. Where'd you learn that? Jake asked. My mom, Scout said softly. She used to say that before she got sick. She said being brave isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. That night, Jake started making calls. He contacted the Wilderness Guide Company and set up an interview for the next day. He scheduled appointments with a therapist and a social worker. He started cleaning out the spare room properly, making it less of a storage space and more of an actual bedroom for Scout. As he worked, Scout helped without being asked. They didn't talk much, but there was a sense of purpose in the air, a feeling that they were building something together. Later, as Jake was getting ready for bed, Scout knocked on his door. "Jake," she said quietly. "Thank you for trying. Even if it doesn't work, thank you for trying." Jake looked at this girl who'd walked out of the woods and changed everything. "We're going to make it work," he said. "I promised I wouldn't give up, and I keep my promises." Scout smiled and went back to her room. Jake lay in bed that night, more awake than he'd been in years. His quiet, simple life was over. The walls he'd built were coming down, whether he liked it or not. And for the first time since the accident, Jake felt something that almost resembled hope. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning started early. Too early. Jake was up before dawn, nervous about his interview with Mountain Peak Adventures, the wilderness guide company. He hadn't had a real job interview in almost a decade, and he'd never been good at talking himself up. Scout was already awake too, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made herself. "Big day," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Yeah," Jake replied, fumbling with his coffee. He'd put on his cleanest flannel shirt and actually combed his beard. It was the best he could do. "You'll do great," Scout said. "You know everything about these mountains. They'd be crazy not to hire you." Jake wished he had her confidence. The interview was at 9 o'clock. The owner of Mountain Peak Adventures, a woman named Kelly Brooks, met him at the small office in town. She was in her 50s, tan and fit, with laugh lines around her eyes. "Jake," she said warmly, shaking his hand, "I've been hoping you'd come see me for years. I've heard you know these mountains better than anyone." "I've lived up there a long time," Jake said, trying not to sound too awkward. They talked for over an hour. Kelly asked about his knowledge of the trails, wildlife, safety procedures. Jake answered honestly, and to his surprise, it came naturally. This was something he knew. This was something he was good at. "I'll be straight with you," Kelly said finally. "I need experienced guides, especially for the advanced trails. Most of my crew is young, enthusiastic, but they don't have your level of experience. I can offer you part-time work now, with the possibility of full-time if it works out. The season's winding down, but we still have autumn tours running, and we'll need people for winter activities soon." "I'll take it," Jake said immediately. Kelly smiled. "Don't you want to know the pay first?" "I need the job," Jake admitted. "I'm trying to become a foster parent. I need to show stable income." Kelly's eyebrows went up. "Really? That's wonderful." "Well, in that case, let me see what I can do about getting you some more hours." Jake left the interview with a job. It wasn't much. Just 3 days a week to start, leading hiking tours and helping with equipment maintenance. But it was official employment, a paycheck, proof that he was a functioning member of society. When he got back to the cabin, Scout was waiting on the porch steps, practically bouncing with nervous energy. "Well?" she asked before he'd even gotten out of the truck. "I got it," Jake said, and Scout let out a whoop of joy that echoed through the mountains. But the celebration was short-lived. That afternoon, Patricia Wong called with an update. "I've filed the preliminary paperwork," she said, "and I've been in contact with Mrs. Foster, Scout's caseworker. She's willing to consider temporary placement with you, but there's a catch." Jake's stomach sank. "What kind of catch?" "She wants a home visit this week. She needs to see where Scout would be living and assess whether it's appropriate. She's also going to interview both of you separately." "Okay," Jake said. "We can do that." "There's more," Patricia continued. "Mrs. Foster has concerns about Scout's education. She's missed almost a full year of school. If you want to keep her, you're going to need to enroll her immediately and make sure she attends regularly." Jake looked at Scout, who was pretending not to listen but clearly hanging on every word. "School, right, I can do that." After the call, Jake sat down with Scout to explain. Her face fell when he mentioned school. "I knew that was coming," she said quietly. "I just hoped I'd have more time." "You don't like school?" Jake asked. "I don't like people," Scout said. "Kids are mean, and teachers always look at me like I'm broken or dangerous or both." Jake understood that feeling more than she knew. "I get it. But we don't have a choice. If we want this to work, you have to go to school." "It's the law," Scout nodded reluctantly. "Okay, I'll do it. But I'm not going to like it." The next few days were a whirlwind. Jake enrolled Scout at the local middle school, which required mountains of paperwork and awkward conversations with the principal about Scout's situation. He started his new job, leading his first hiking tour. with a group of tourists who were delighted by his knowledge and slightly intimidated by his gruff demeanor. And he started therapy. Dr. Raymond Mitchell was a therapist in town who specialized in grief and trauma. Sheriff Morrison had recommended him, and Jake had been dreading the appointment. "Tell me why you're here," Dr. Mitchell said in their first session. He was an older man with kind eyes and a calm voice that somehow made the small office feel safe. "I have to be," Jake said bluntly. "I'm trying to become a foster parent. They require a psychological evaluation." "But if you didn't have to be here, you wouldn't be," Dr. Mitchell observed. "No," Jake admitted. "Can you tell me about your family? The one you lost?" Jake tensed. He'd known this was coming, but that didn't make it easier. Slowly, painfully, he told the story. The accident. The guilt. The 7 years of hiding. Dr. Mitchell listened without judgment, just taking notes and occasionally asking gentle questions. "And now you want to be a father again," Dr. Mitchell said. "That's a big step for someone who's been avoiding emotional connection for so long." "I'm not avoiding it anymore," Jake said. "I can't. Scout needs me." "What about what you need?" Dr. Mitchell asked. Jake didn't have an answer for that. On Thursday, Mrs. Foster came to the cabin for the home visit. She was a tired-looking woman in her 40s, carrying a worn briefcase and wearing an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and trusted nothing. She walked through the cabin slowly, checking the bedrooms, the bathroom, the kitchen. She looked at the smoke detectors Jake had installed, the first aid kit he'd put in the bathroom, the child-proof locks he'd added to the cleaning supplies cabinet. "It's rustic," Mrs. Foster said finally, "but clean and safe. That's more than I can say for some placements I've seen." She interviewed Scout first, asking her questions about how she felt living with Jake, whether she felt safe, whether she was being fed properly and treated well. Jake waited outside, pacing the porch and wondering what Scout was saying. When it was his turn, Mrs. Foster's questions were more pointed. "Why do you want to do this, Mr. Webb? You've been alone for 7 years. Why suddenly take on the responsibility of a traumatized 12-year-old? "Because she asked me to," Jake said. "And because I have something to offer her. A stable home. Someone who won't give up on her." "Do you have any experience with children?" "I had a son," Jake said quietly. "He died 7 years ago." Mrs. Foster's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Webb, this girl isn't a replacement for your son. She comes with her own trauma, her own needs." "I know that," Jake said. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm trying to help a kid who needs help." Mrs. Foster studied him for a long moment. "Scout speaks highly of you. She says you're patient, kind, and you don't make her feel like a burden. That's important." She paused. "But I have to be honest. Your application is going to face significant scrutiny. Single men rarely get approved for foster care, especially for girls approaching their teen years. The board will have concerns." "What can I do to address those concerns?" Jake asked. "Keep doing what you're doing. Maintain employment. Continue therapy. Enroll Scout in school and make sure she attends. Follow every rule, meet every requirement. And even then, it might not be enough." After Mrs. Foster left, Jake felt defeated. Scout found him sitting on the porch steps staring at the mountains. "She didn't say yes, did she?" Scout asked, sitting down beside him. "She didn't say no either," Jake replied. "She said we have to keep proving ourselves." "For how long?" "I don't know." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Finally, Scout spoke. "What if they say no in the end? What if we do everything right and they still say no?" Jake looked at her, this brave, stubborn girl who'd walked into his life and refused to leave. "Then we appeal. We fight harder. We don't give up, promise?" Scout asked, her voice small. "Promise," Jake said. On Monday, Scout started school. Jake drove her down the mountain and walked her to the front entrance. She looked terrified but was trying hard to hide it. "You've got this," Jake said, "and I'll be right here at 3 to pick you up." "What if I mess up?" Scout asked. "What if I get in trouble or say something wrong?" "Then we deal with it," Jake said. "But Scout, you're smart and tough. You've survived things most kids can't even imagine. You can handle middle school." Scout nodded and took a deep breath. Then she walked through those doors, disappearing into a world of other kids and teachers and expectations. Jake drove back up the mountain feeling anxious. This was the first time he and Scout had been truly separated since she'd arrived. What if something went wrong? What if someone recognized her and caused problems? He tried to distract himself with work, but the hours crawled by. Finally, at 2:30, he headed back down to the school. Scout emerged at 3, looking exhausted but intact. She climbed into the truck without a word and stared out the window. "How was it?" Jake asked carefully. "Weird," Scout said. "Everyone kept staring at me. The teachers made me introduce myself in every class. This one girl, Rebecca, she asked me where I came from and why I talk so little. I didn't know what to say." "What did you tell her?" "That I'm from around here and I just like being quiet." Scout sighed. "She said I was weird and walked away." Jake felt anger flare. Kids can be cruel. The 4 weeks before the court hearing turned into a crash course in becoming a functional parent. Jake had thought taking care of Scout would be simple, just making sure she was fed and safe. He'd been wrong. There were permission slips to sign, parent-teacher conferences to attend, emotional meltdowns to navigate. There were questions he didn't know how to answer, problems he didn't know how to solve. And through it all, Jake had to keep proving himself, not just to the court system but to himself. The first parent-teacher conference was a disaster. Jake showed up at the school wearing his cleanest clothes, feeling completely out of place among the other parents who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Scout's math teacher, Mr. Peterson, started with the positive. "Scout is very bright," he said. "She picks up concepts quickly when she's engaged." "But," Jake asked because he could hear it coming, "but she's behind. She's missed so much school that she's struggling with the basics, and she doesn't ask for help. She just sits there trying to figure it out alone." Jake understood that feeling. "What can I do?" Mr. Peterson suggested a tutor. Her English teacher suggested the same thing. So did her science teacher. By the end of the meetings, Jake had a list of recommendations that would cost money he didn't really have. But he found a way. Kelly at Mountain Peak Adventures gave him extra hours. Jake started leading weekend tours even though it meant less time at home. He was exhausted, but it was worth it when he could afford to hire a retired teacher named Mrs. Graham to tutor Scout 3 afternoons a week. Scout protested at first. "I don't need a tutor. I can teach myself." "You're smart enough to teach yourself," Jake agreed. "But you don't have to do everything alone anymore." That's the point. Mrs. Graham turned out to be exactly what Scout needed. She was patient, kind, and didn't treat Scout like she was broken. She just focused on filling in the gaps, making learning feel less like a punishment and more like a puzzle to solve. Slowly, Scout's grades improved. More importantly, her confidence grew. But school wasn't the only challenge. Jake's therapy sessions were getting harder as Dr. Mitchell pushed him to confront things he'd been avoiding for 7 years. "You blame yourself for the accident," Dr. Mitchell said one session. "But have you ever considered forgiving yourself?" "I don't deserve forgiveness," Jake said automatically. "Why not?" "Because they died and I lived. Because I was driving. Because," Jake's voice broke. "Because if I'd just been paying attention, if I'd just seen that car sooner, they'd still be here." "Maybe," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "Or maybe the accident would have happened anyway. Maybe no amount of attention could have prevented it." "You've never considered that possibility, have you?" Jake hadn't. For 7 years, he'd carried the certainty of his guilt like a weight around his neck. The idea that it might not be entirely his fault felt wrong, almost like a betrayal. "Your wife and son wouldn't want you to live like this," Dr. Mitchell continued. "Would they? Would they want you to hide on a mountain, refusing to let anyone close?" Jake thought about Beth, her kindness, and her laughter. He thought about Tommy, who'd been full of life and joy. "No," he admitted quietly. "They wouldn't." Then maybe it's time to start living for them, not dying for them. That session stayed with Jake for days. He found himself thinking about Beth and Tommy differently, not just with grief and guilt, but with gratitude for the time they'd had together. It didn't erase the pain, but it softened it somehow. Meanwhile, Scout was fighting her own battles at school. The girl who'd called her weird, Rebecca, had apparently decided to make Scout's life difficult. She'd spread rumors that Scout was a charity case, that Jake wasn't really her guardian, that she was just staying with him until they found her a real family. Scout tried to hide how much it bothered her, but Jake could see the signs. She'd come home quiet and withdrawn, picking at her dinner and disappearing into her room earlier each night. Finally, one evening, Jake knocked on her door. "Want to talk about it?" he asked. "About what?" Scout said, not looking up from her book. "About whatever's making you miserable." Scout was quiet for a long moment. Then she set down her book. "There's this girl at school. She keeps saying things about me, about us. She told everyone you're not really my dad, that I'm just a project or a phase or something. Jake felt anger flare, but he kept his voice calm. Does it bother you what she says? Yes, Scout admitted. Because part of me worries she's right. What if the court says no? What if this is all temporary? Then everything she's saying will be true. Jake sat down on the edge of Scout's bed. Listen to me. Whether the court says yes or no, you're not a project. You're not a phase. You're a kid who deserves a home and someone who cares about you. And I care about you. That's not going to change. But what if we lose? Scout asked, her voice small. Then we fight harder. We appeal. We find another way. I promised I wouldn't give up, and I meant it. Scout wiped at her eyes quickly. Rebecca also said I act like a boy, and that's weird. Because I don't wear dresses or talk about boys or whatever. You know what's weird? Jake said. Caring that much about what other people wear or talk about. You be exactly who you are, Scout. Don't let anyone tell you that's wrong. Scout managed a small smile. Thanks. The next day at school, Scout marched right up to Rebecca at lunch. Jake only found out about it later when the principal called. Mr. Webb, Principal Harris said, we had a small incident today involving Scout. She confronted another student verbally. No violence, but the other student felt threatened. Jake's heart sank. What happened? According to witnesses, Scout told Rebecca to stop spreading rumors about her. When Rebecca laughed it off, Scout apparently said, and I quote, I've survived worse than you on the streets. You don't scare me. So knock it off or I'll make sure everyone knows you're the actual bully here. Jake tried not to smile. Is Scout in trouble? Technically, yes. We don't tolerate threats, but between you and me, Rebecca has been a problem for a while. Scout stood up for herself, which takes courage. I gave her a verbal warning, but I also had a longer conversation with Rebecca. Principal Harris paused. Scout's a good kid, Mr. Webb. She's got a lot of strength. Just help her channel it appropriately. I will, Jake promised. That night, Jake and Scout had a long talk about standing up for yourself versus making threats. Scout argued that she hadn't actually threatened anyone, just pointed out facts. Jake tried to explain the difference while secretly being proud of her for not backing down. As the court date approached, Jake and Scout both felt the pressure mounting. Mrs. Foster made another surprise visit, this time observing them during dinner. She watched how they interacted, how Jake made sure Scout ate her vegetables, how Scout helped clean up without being asked. You've built a good routine, Mrs. Foster observed.
Scout seems comfortable here. I am comfortable, Scout said firmly.
This is my home. Mrs. Foster made notes but didn't commit to anything. Dr. Mitchell completed his evaluation of Jake and submitted his report to the court. He wouldn't tell Jake what he'd written, but he did say, I told them the truth, that you're doing the work, facing your demons, and genuinely trying to be there for this child. Patricia called a few days before the hearing to prepare them. The judge will ask you both questions. Be honest, be respectful, and show them the bond you've built. Jake, they're going to question whether you're capable of raising a teenage girl. Be ready to address those concerns. How do I do that? Jake asked. By showing them you already are, Patricia said simply. The night before the hearing, neither Jake nor Scout could sleep. They ended up sitting on the porch together around midnight, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars. I'm scared, Scout admitted. What if the judge doesn't like me? What if I say something wrong? Then we deal with it, Jake said. But Scout, just be yourself. Tell them the truth about how you feel. That's all you can do. What if my truth isn't good enough? Jake looked at this girl who'd changed his entire life in just a few months. Your truth is that you're brave, resilient, and deserving of a family. If they can't see that, it's their loss. Scout leaned against Jake's shoulder, something she'd never done before. I'm glad I found you, she said quietly. Even if this doesn't work out, I'm glad I tried. Me too, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. They sat there together until the sun started to rise, two people who'd found each other against all odds, hoping desperately that hope would be enough. The next morning, they dressed in their best clothes. Jake wore a suit he'd bought specifically for the hearing, feeling uncomfortable and restricted. Scout wore a simple dress that Mrs. Graham had helped her pick out, looking older and more nervous than any kid should have to look. As they drove to the courthouse, Jake reached over and squeezed Scout's hand. Whatever happens, he said, we're in this together. Scout squeezed back. Together, she agreed. The courthouse loomed ahead, full of lawyers and judges and people who would decide their fate. But Jake wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't running. He was fighting for something that mattered. He was fighting for family, and he wasn't going to lose without giving it everything he had. The courtroom was smaller than Jake expected, but somehow that made it more intimidating. Dark wood panels covered the walls, and the judge's bench sat elevated at the front, making whoever sat behind it look powerful and unreachable. Jake's hands were sweating as he took his seat next to Patricia Wong at the petitioner's table. Scout sat in a separate waiting area until she'd be called to testify. She'd looked so small and scared when they'd separated, and Jake hated that he couldn't be there to reassure her. Judge Elizabeth Carter entered, and everyone stood. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an expression that gave nothing away. Jake's heart pounded as she settled into her seat and opened the case file. This is a preliminary hearing regarding the petition of Jacob Webb for guardianship of the minor child known as Scout. Legal name Lily Chen, Judge Carter began. She looked at Jake over her reading glasses. Mr. Webb, you understand that this hearing will determine whether your petition moves forward to a full guardianship review? Yes, Your Honor, Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. Very well. Let's proceed. Patricia stood and presented Jake's case. She explained how Scout had come to him, how he'd immediately sought to do things legally, how he'd transformed his life over the past months to provide stability. She submitted evidence of his employment, his therapy sessions, Scout's school enrollment and improving grades, and letters of support from Sheriff Morrison, Dr. Mitchell, and Kelly from Mountain Peak Adventures. Then it was the state's turn. A lawyer named Robert Thornton represented Child Protective Services. He was younger than Jake expected, with a professional demeanor and a stack of documents. Your Honor, Thornton began, while we appreciate Mr. Webb's efforts and his good intentions, we have significant concerns about this placement. Mr. Webb is a single male with no parenting experience beyond a son who died 7 years ago. He has been essentially isolated from society for most of that time, dealing with untreated depression and grief. Jake felt each word like a punch, but Patricia had warned him this would happen. Furthermore, Thornton continued, the minor in question is approaching her teenage years, a time when young girls need female guidance and role models. Mr. Webb, despite his recent employment, has limited financial resources and lives in a remote location that makes access to services and emergency care difficult. Thornton pulled out more papers. We also have concerns about how this placement began. Mr. Webb kept a runaway minor for weeks without reporting her. While we understand his reasoning, it shows a disregard for proper procedures and legal protocols. Judge Carter listened carefully, making notes. Then she looked at Patricia. How do you respond to these concerns? Patricia stood again. Your Honor, Mr. Webb did not keep Scout secretly. He reported her presence to law enforcement within weeks and has been working with the system since. As for his qualifications, he has demonstrated more dedication to this child's well-being in 3 months than the state has in 3 years. Thornton started to object, but Judge Carter held up her hand. I'll hear the testimony and make my own determinations. Mr. Thornton, call your first witness. The state called Mrs. Foster first. She took the stand and was sworn in, looking tired and overwhelmed as always. Thornton asked her about Scout's case history, her placements, her behavioral issues. Mrs. Foster detailed the multiple homes, the runaways, the difficulties. In your professional opinion, Thornton asked, would Scout benefit from placement with Mr. Webb, or would she be better served in a traditional foster home with an experienced family? Mrs. Foster hesitated. Jake held his breath. Honestly, Mrs. Foster said, I don't know. Traditional placements have failed this child repeatedly, but Mr. Webb is unconventional. He lacks experience. It's a risk either way. But you're not endorsing this placement? Thornton pressed. I'm not opposing it either, Mrs. Foster said firmly. Scout is thriving with Mr. Webb in ways she hasn't in previous placements. That matters. Thornton looked frustrated. Patricia looked pleased. Judge Carter just made more notes. Next, Patricia called Sheriff Morrison, who testified about Jake's character, his cooperation with law enforcement, and Scout's obvious improvement since living with him. He's a good man who's been through hell, Sheriff Morrison said. And that girl needs someone who understands survival. Jake Webb does. Then Dr. Mitchell took the stand. He discussed Jake's therapy progress, his grief work, his genuine commitment to healing. Mr. Webb is doing something most people can't, Dr. Mitchell said. He's facing his darkest fears and choosing to love again anyway. That takes tremendous courage. Is he perfect? No. But he's honest about his limitations and actively working to address them. That's what good parenting looks like. Finally, it was Scout's turn. Jake watched anxiously as she was called to the stand. She looked so small up there, but she held her head high as she was sworn in. Patricia questioned her first, asking gentle questions about her life with Jake, how she felt, whether she felt safe. I've never felt safer, Scout said clearly. Jake doesn't pretend everything's fine. He doesn't treat me like I'm broken. He just treats me like I matter. Do you want to stay with Mr. Webb? Patricia asked. More than anything, Scout said, her voice cracking slightly. He's the only person who's ever kept his promises to me. Then it was Thornton's turn for cross-examination. Jake tensed, knowing this would be harder. Scout, Thornton said gently, you've been through a lot. Sometimes that can make us attached to people quickly, especially people who are kind to us. How do you know what you feel for Mr. Webb is real, and not just gratitude for being rescued? Scout looked at Thornton directly. Because gratitude fades. This doesn't. Jake didn't rescue me. I rescued him too. We needed each other. That's what family is. Thornton tried a different approach. Don't you think you'd be happier with a traditional family? A mother and a father? Other children to be around? I've had traditional families, Scout said, and there was steel in her voice now. 5 of them. They didn't want me. They wanted the check they got for keeping me, or they wanted to feel good about themselves for helping a poor foster kid. Jake wants me, just me. That's the difference. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. Scout, I'd like to ask you something directly. What would you do if I ruled against this placement today? If I said you couldn't stay with Mr. Webb? Scout's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. I'd run again, and this time I wouldn't come back. Because if I can't stay with someone who actually cares, I'd rather take my chances alone. The courtroom went silent. Jake felt his chest tighten. That wasn't what they'd practiced. Patricia had specifically told Scout not to threaten running away. But looking at her face, Jake knew it wasn't a threat. It was the truth. Judge Carter studied Scout for a long moment. You understand that's not a healthy choice? That the system exists to protect you? The system hasn't protected me, Scout said quietly. It's just moved me around like I'm a problem to solve. Jake doesn't try to solve me. He just lets me be who I am while helping me become who I want to be. That's what I need. Thornton had no more questions. Scout stepped down from the stand and returned to the waiting area. Jake wanted desperately to tell her she'd done well, that he was proud of her, but they wouldn't let him. Finally, Judge Carter called Jake to the stand. Patricia led him through the basics first. His background, his job, his home, his plans for Scout's future. Jake answered honestly, trying not to sound as nervous as he felt. Mr. Webb, Patricia said, why do you want to be Scout's guardian? Jake took a breath. Because she asked me to be her father, and nobody's asked me to be anything in 7 years. Because she reminds me that life is worth living even when it hurts, and because I failed my son, but maybe I don't have to fail her. You didn't fail your son, Patricia said gently. That was an accident. I know that now, Jake said. I'm learning that. But whether I failed him or not, I won't fail Scout. She deserves someone who fights for her. I'm ready to be that person. Then Thornton stood for cross-examination. Mr. Webb, you've been in therapy for what, 3 months? Yes. And before that you spent 7 years essentially hiding from the world, correct? Yes. So how can you expect this court to believe you're capable of providing the emotional stability this child needs when you've barely begun addressing your own mental health? Jake felt anger flare but forced himself to stay calm. Because I'm doing the work. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm facing my problems head on, and I'm teaching Scout to do the same. We're healing together. That's a nice sentiment, Thornton said, but this child has been through severe trauma. She needs professional care, stability, resources. Can you honestly provide all of that from a cabin in the mountains? I can provide what she needs most, Jake said firmly. Someone who won't give up on her. Someone who sees her as a person, not a case file or a problem. Someone who will be there every single day no matter what. Thornton pressed harder. What happens when Scout becomes a teenager and starts dealing with issues you can't understand? What happens when she needs feminine guidance, advice about things a single man can't provide? Then I'll find people who can help, Jake said. Mrs. Graham, her tutor, has already become a mentor. Sheriff Morrison has offered to be available. I'm not too proud to ask for help when Scout needs it. 1 year, that's what they had. 365 days to prove they belonged together. The first few weeks after the hearing felt like walking on eggshells. Jake kept expecting something to go wrong, for someone to show up and say it was all a mistake. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and slowly, life found its rhythm. Scout's 13th birthday came in November. Jake had never thrown a party before, didn't even know where to start. But Mrs. Graham helped him plan something small at the cabin. They invited Sheriff Morrison, Dr. Mitchell, Kelly from Mountain Peak Adventures, and a few kids from Scout school, including Danny, the boy who'd been kind to her that first day. Scout pretended she didn't care about having a birthday party. But Jake saw how her face lit up when everyone sang happy birthday. She'd never had a real party before, she admitted later. Just one with her mom when she was little before things got bad. Jake gave her a gift he'd been working on for weeks. A carved wooden box with her name on it. Not Lily, not Scout, but Maya, her mother's name for her. You can put important things in here, Jake said. Things you want to keep safe. Scout ran her fingers over the carved letters. You remembered, she said softly. Of course I remembered. That night, after everyone left and they were cleaning up, Scout said something that made Jake's chest ache. This was the best birthday I've ever had. Thank you for making me feel like I matter. You do matter, Jake said firmly. Don't ever forget that. Winter came hard that year. The mountains got buried in snow, and Jake taught Scout how to snowshoe, how to track animals in fresh powder, how to survive if you got caught in a storm. She learned fast, asking questions and remembering everything. School got easier too. Scout would never be the most popular kid, but she found her people. Danny became a real friend. There was a girl named Amy in her English class who liked the same books. And even Rebecca, the bully, had backed off after Scout stood up to her. Scout's grades improved steadily. She was never going to be a straight-A student. Too much time had been lost for that. But she worked hard, and by spring she was almost caught up with her grade level. Mrs. Graham said she'd never seen a student more determined to succeed. Jake's life changed too. Working as a wilderness guide forced him to interact with people regularly, and while it was exhausting at first, it got easier. He even started to enjoy it, sharing his knowledge of the mountains. Seeing people's faces light up when they spotted wildlife or reached a summit reminded him of what he'd been missing. His therapy sessions with Dr. Mitchell became less about grief and more about moving forward. They talked about parenting challenges, about Jake's fears, about how to balance giving Scout freedom while keeping her safe. You're doing better than you think, Dr. Mitchell told him one session. Scout is thriving because you're letting her be herself while providing structure. That's good parenting. I still feel like I'm making it up as I go, Jake admitted. That's what all parents feel, Dr. Mitchell said with a smile. The difference is you're honest about it, but it wasn't all smooth. There were hard moments too. In February, Scout had a massive breakdown when she saw a woman at the grocery store who looked like her mother. She'd run out of the store shaking and hyperventilating. Jake found her sitting by the truck crying harder than he'd ever seen. I miss her, Scout sobbed. Even though she wasn't good at being a mom, even though she chose the drugs over me, I still miss her. Does that make me stupid? No, Jake said, sitting beside her in the snow. That makes you human. You can miss someone and be angry at them at the same time. Love's complicated like that. They sat there until Scout cried herself out. Then they went home and Jake made hot chocolate and they talked about Scout's mom. Really talked. Scout shared memories, good ones and bad ones, and Jake just listened. In March, Jake had his own breakdown. The anniversary of the accident hit him harder than usual. He woke up from a nightmare about the crash and couldn't go back to sleep. Scout found him on the porch at 3 a.m, staring at nothing. She didn't say anything. Just brought him a blanket and sat beside him in silence. After a while, she said, "It's okay to still hurt. Healing isn't linear." Jake looked at her surprised. "Where'd you learn that?" "Mrs. Graham, she said it when I was having a bad day. I guess it works for you too." They sat together until sunrise, and Jake realized that Scout wasn't just someone he was taking care of. She was taking care of him too. That's what family did. Spring brought new challenges. Scout started asking questions about the future, about what would happen at the 1-year hearing. "What if they say no?" she asked one night at dinner. What if the judge decides I should go somewhere else? Then we appeal, Jake said. We fight it. But Scout, I don't think that's going to happen. We've done everything they asked. More than they asked. But what if it's not enough? Jake reached across the table and took her hand. Then we'll figure it out together. No matter what happens at that hearing, you're my daughter. A piece of paper might say otherwise, but that won't change how I feel. Scout's eyes filled with tears. Do you mean that? I've never meant anything more in my life. As the 1-year mark approached, Mrs. Foster made her final evaluation visit. She spent a whole day at the cabin, observing their interactions, checking Scout's room, reviewing her school records and medical files. At the end of the day, she sat down with both of them at the kitchen table. I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Foster said. When this case first landed on my desk, I thought it was a terrible idea. Single man, no experience, living in isolation. Every red flag in the book. Jake's stomach dropped. But, Mrs. Foster continued, I was wrong. Scout, you've transformed this past year. You're healthier, happier, and more stable than I've ever seen you. And Jake, you've proven that unconventional doesn't mean inappropriate. You've worked harder than most foster parents I've seen. So what does that mean? Scout asked nervously. It means I'm recommending that your guardianship be made permanent. And if you choose to pursue adoption, I'll support that too. Scout burst into tears. Jake felt his own eyes burning. Thank you, he managed to say. Don't thank me, Mrs. Foster said. You two did the work. I'm just writing it down. The final hearing came on a crisp autumn day exactly 1 year after the first one. The courtroom felt less intimidating this time. Judge Carter reviewed the reports, the evaluations, the evidence of Scout's progress. Mr. Webb, Judge Carter said, you've exceeded expectations. Scout's school records show consistent attendance and good grades. Her medical and dental care is up to date. Her emotional well-being, according to Dr. Mitchell and Mrs. Foster, has improved dramatically. You've maintained steady employment and continued your own therapy. You've done everything asked of you and more. Jake held Scout's hand tightly. Therefore, I'm granting permanent legal guardianship. Additionally, if both parties agree, I'm prepared to approve an adoption petition. Judge Carter looked at Scout. Scout, do you want Mr. Webb to adopt you? To become your legal father in every way? Scout stood up, her voice clear and strong. Yes, Your Honor, more than anything. And Mr. Webb? Jake stood too. Yes, Your Honor. It would be the greatest honor of my life. Judge Carter smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from her. Then by the power vested in me by the state, I hereby grant the adoption petition. Scout, you are now officially Maya Webb. Or Scout Webb if you prefer. The choice is yours. Scout looked at Jake. Can I be both? Scout Maya Webb? You can be whoever you want to be, Jake said, his voice breaking with emotion. Then I'm Scout Maya Webb, she declared. And Jake is my dad. Outside the courthouse, Patricia congratulated them both. You beat the odds, she said. Hold on to that. They drove back to the mountain in comfortable silence. When they pulled up to the cabin, Scout just sat in the truck for a moment looking at it. This is really home now, she said. Not temporary. Not until they find something better. Just home. Just home, Jake agreed. That night they had a quiet celebration. Just the two of them. A special dinner and the chocolate cake that Mrs. Graham had taught Scout how to make. They sat on the porch afterward, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars come out. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't found you? Scout asked. Like if I'd given up or gone to someone else or just stayed on the streets? Sometimes, Jake admitted. And it terrifies me. Me too. I almost didn't come up here, you know. I almost talked myself out of it. I thought maybe you'd be mean or dangerous or wouldn't want to be bothered. I'm glad you didn't talk yourself out of it. Scout leaned against his shoulder. You know what's weird? I came looking for a father, but I think I gave you something too. You were just as lost as I was. You saved me, Jake said simply. I was dying up here even if I was still breathing. You gave me a reason to live again. So we saved each other. Yeah, we saved each other. They sat in silence for a while, just being together. Scout Maya Webb and her father Jake. A family born not from blood or tradition, but from choice and determination, and refusing to give up on each other. Dad? Scout said, testing out the word. Yeah? Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for keeping your promise. Jake pulled her closer. This brave, impossible girl who'd walked out of the woods and demanded he be her father.